northern colonies and the southern colonies also developed different economies at the time. The Chesapeake colonies relied heavily on the tobacco trade, which followed a boom and bust pattern, and busted for the first time in 1640. However, farmers did not understand the underlying forces behind the boom and bust pattern. In South Carolina and Georgia, rice was the main trade. Rice was created by damming paddies in coastal rivers. Because white laborers refused to work in the swampy, insect-infected, hot, marshy rice paddies of Georgia and South Carolina, the planters depended on slave labor more than anywhere else. Also, Africans were better at the work and better immune to diseases. Indigo was also big in South Carolina. Eliza Lucas in the early 1740s experimented with growing the West Indian plant. She made blue dyes. She found that it could grow in the highlands of South Carolina and was in harvest while rice was still growing. This became an important import to England, and unlike the North, dependence of the South on cash crops created few merchant commercial towns. The northern economies relied heavily on technology. Agriculture dominated, but it was diverse. Farther north, the soil was rocky, hard, and cold, and so no large agricultural exploits could take place. New York, Pennsylvania, and the Connecticut River Valley were substantial wheat suppliers to the south. In the north, almost every family engaged in some sort of home-based trade. There were silversmiths, blacksmiths, rifle makers. Iron became an important trade in the north. In Saugus, Massachusetts, in 1646, the first real metal industry was created. The Hansklaver Iron Works factory was created in 1764, founded by Peter Hansklaver, who took the German iron techniques and applied them in his factory in New Jersey. It became a large industrial enterprise in North America, and Hansklaver began importing German workers and funded by his American capital. However, concerned by the growing iron industry in the colonies, Parliament enacted the Iron Act of 1750, which restricted the metal processing in the colonies and also restricted the trade of other processed goods. This prevented the colonies from going through the Industrial Revolution as England had done. However, there were many obstacles to the growing economy in the North. One of the major and most important obstacles was a smaller workforce. And as a result, the economy in the North could not grow. This most important source of economic growth came from industries that exploited natural resources. Fur trade was in decline, but was replaced with fishing, lumbering, and mining, and they could trade these with the English for manufactured goods. As the colonial commerce began to rise, it faced many obstacles. There was no unified currency in the colonies. They tried to use tobacco and property standards, but that did not work. The commercial world in the colonies was fragmented, and there was a few isolated companies that fiercely competed in the colonial commerce. An important aspect of the colonial commerce was the triangular trade. It was a trade that occurred between the colonies, the Caribbean, and Europe. There emerged a small group of adventurous entrepreneurs, which eventually created the commercial class in the colonies. Later in the 18th century, the commercial climate of the colonies began to stabilize, and the first entrepreneurs came from the triangular trade. As a result, there came a rise of consumerism. The growing prosperity of Great Britain and the abundance of manufactured goods made the colonies hungry for commercial goods. The growing class separation promoted consumerism, as the rich wanted to buy more and more consumer goods to display their class. Merchants advertised goods in journals and traveled around to promote their products. There were, however, many social consequences as a result of the growing consumerism. What was once considered luxury goods became necessity. There became the increasingly solidified idea of a gentleman and a lady, and thus many people bought consumer goods to define their gentleman-like character or their lady-like character. The plantation was a center of life for the people in the southern colonies. They first came about in Maryland and Virginia. The plantation owners survived the unstable agricultural economic climate of the 1660s. Because plantations were far from towns, they became self-contained communities. On large plantations, women attended to family more because they had slaves do the household work. There were often, in these big plantations, sexual liaisons between the planters, typically a white male, and black women. This stratified Southern society because large plantation owners not only controlled their workforce, but controlled the livelihoods of smaller plantations. They bought crops from small plantations who they outcompeted and lived in relative poverty. Plantation slavery was also a big topic at the time. Slaves developed their own cultures, which were somewhat influenced by the whites. They developed a strong, elaborate family structure. They also developed their own language, Gullah, a hybrid of the English and African tongues. They also developed a religion which was a hybrid of the European Christianity and their own African religions. And thus there came about an independent black culture. However, there were many incidences of slave uprisings. Most notable was the Stoner Rebellion in 1739. In South Carolina, where about 100 slaves rose up, seized weapons, and killed many whites and tried to escape to South Florida. However, as many slaves, like in the Stoner Rebellion, and many others in different rebellions tried to escape, they had nowhere to go, and thus they were caught immediately. The Puritan societies of the North were very different than the plantation-based societies of the South. They were formed around towns, not farms. Each settlement drew up their own covenant, where people pledged a religious commitment to peace and harmony. There was a sense of democracy. Each year, town meetings were held, where people were elected as officials, and they governed until the next meeting. Primogeniture was not a trend in the Americas, where a father passed all of his belongings to his eldest son. Fathers divided land to all their sons. However, as a result of these trends, there came about many societal pressures. Consumerism threatened the traditional spirit. As the population grew, people needed to move outside the towns to create their own farms. But as generations came and went, the land was split, and as the land kept getting split up, it became too small. And the newest generation could not use that land to sufficient use. And thus there came about a series of land disputes. The witchcraft phenomenon is a dark mark in the Puritan society at the time. It came about mainly in England as hysteria broke out in the 1680s and 1690s. The most famous of which was the Salem witch trials, where 19 residents of Salem were put to death, and hundreds were accused of witchcraft. The trials ended in 1692. As opposed to the southern societies, cities grew and grew in the northern society. By the 1770s, the largest ports were Philadelphia and New York. New York had a population of 28,000, and Philadelphia had a population of 25,000. These cities were trading centers for farmers and for markets for international trade. They were centers of what little industry existed in the colonies. Also, they were the centers of the most prestigious schools and cultural activities in the colonies as well. But also, they were the center of the crime and ugliness that was rarely seen in the smaller towns. A new religious wave also took the colonies at this time, which became later known as the Great Awakening. However, we'll cover a brief background on the religious patterns of the colonies before getting into the Great Awakening. Religious toleration flourished more in America than anywhere else in Europe because it was required, as many people of different faiths immigrated to the colonies. The Anglican Confession was royally imposed in Virginia, Maryland, New York, the Carolinas, and Georgias. The Baptists emerged at the time, with Roger Williams being the first. Protestants at the time were more accepting of other sects of Protestantism than of Catholics. Most Catholics who resided in Maryland, 3,000 of them, were persecuted. There were only about 2,000 Jews in the Americas at any given time. The Great Awakening first started in the 1730s and reached its zenith in the 1740s. It brought about a new feeling of piety to the colonies after the growing secularism of the Enlightenment. It had a particular appeal to women. It emphasized the potential of everybody to break away from the past and start anew with an individual, personal relationship with God. One of the first and early leaders of the Great Awakening were two brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who founded the Methodist Church in Georgia in the 1730s. George Whitefield was another preacher who made tours around the colonies. Jonathan Edwards was the most prominent Great Awakening leader. He was a devout Puritan with new ideas. He believed that men and women could achieve salvation by God's grace alone. The Great Awakening led to the division between New Light and Old Light. New Light people were the people who accepted the new faiths of the Great Awakening, and Old Light, traditionalist people, were the people of faiths before the Great Awakening. The Enlightenment was the antithesis of the Great Awakening ideals. It emphasized reason, rationality, in a search for truth, not God. However, they were not anti-religious. They wanted to rationally support Christianity and not destroy it. During the 18th centuries, however, the Americans did not contribute a lot to the Enlightenment thinkers. The Enlightenment thinkers mainly resided in Europe. Education also changed at the time.